DragonWarrior is a highly offensive class that can output some of the highest damage in the game, though its defensive abilities are rather lacking as a compromise. Because of its huge damage potential, it fares surprisingly well against many of the in-bosses and is a strong choice for anyone looking to beat challenges quickly. In this video I shall discuss the strengths and weaknesses of the class and explain how you should approach in-challenges with DragonWarrior, when to use it, how to use it, and what gear and support you want to bring along. Let's start by looking at the main selling point of DragonWarrior, its great damage output. When we look at damage that classes can deal with a single attack, DragonWarrior is right up there with Doom Knights and the Weavers. It can deal up to 7,000 damage in one turn. The only thing that comes close to a full-powered unleash is a really sweaty Soul Sink. To achieve this damage you need to follow a strict rotation, wherein you make use of the class's Dragon's Fury mechanic, stack your multiple buffs, and then unleash them all with your sequential big damage skills. The rotation is as follows: Onslaught, Frenzy, Warcry, Double Attack, Dragon Flare, Triple Attack, Unleash. Onslaught offers a huge increase to your bonus, letting you ignore all but the strongest shields in the game, which is a really nice niche to have. At level 90 you can reliably hit through plus 300 shields or even 400 with a Dragon Scout. Frenzy applies a plus 75 boost buff at the expense of a negative 60 all resistance debuff. More importantly however, when both Dragon's Onslaught and Frenzy are applied, DragonWarrior gains plus 100 damage per hit from its class Dragon's Fury mechanic, which turns higher hit count moves into extremely strong nukes. Warcry is a plus 20 boost move that's shared by every class in the warrior line. Double is the first skill in the classic double triple unleash sequence, and it effectively deals 350% damage before boost under Dragon's Fury. Dragon's Flare is a damage boosting skill first and a shield second. You get 2 turns of plus 50 boost instead of the 1 turn you get with base warrior, letting you make use of this buff when using both triple and unleash, which, thanks to Dragon's Fury, deal 525 and 1050% damage respectively before boost. To maximise our damage, we want to make good use of pets during our damage rotation. Now, there's 2 main sources of damage really, there's Dragon and there's Stan the Scan Orb. So a Dragon's Overcharge can be used on the turn you use Flare for bonus damage on your triple and unleash, and it's the same thing with Stan. You just use an attack with him on the Flare turn, and then you get bonus damage on your triple and unleash. Bear in mind that you do need to be above half health to use Stan effectively, so a good way to do it is to use Stan for the first enemy in a duo, and then use Dragon's Charge for the second enemy, when you'll be at lower health. The whole rotation deals between about 10,000 and 14,000 damage, depending on whether or not you have pet support, whether or not you use a strength stack, and that sort of stuff. At the higher levels, this is around 2,000 damage per turn. The rotation is a guiding pillar for this class, and we'll be coming back to it throughout the video. It is quite rigid, though there is some room for flexibility because you can stick a skill in between Onslaught and Frenzy. This can be handy for when you want to stun bosses or use a weapon special. It's quite tempting to compare DragonWarrior's offensive capabilities to Chaos Weaver's, due to the similarities between Soul Gambit and Dragon's Frenzy. They're both skills that make you deal a lot more damage at the expense of taking a lot more damage too. However, whereas Chaos Weaver is flexible and quick off the mark in dealing its damage, DragonWarrior builds up to it slowly. Its damage is a lot less spread out. If anything, the class feels like Soul Weaver. Every skill you use is another damage stack in preparation for 1 or 2 turns of concentrated damage. Their nukes are even called the same thing. Most classes do operate in a similar way where you have offensive rotations, but the sequential nature of the two makes them feel quite similar, at least offensively. Coming from DragonWarrior's superb offenses, it's very sobering to look at its defenses, which are exactly the same as base warriors. You have a 2-turn 140 BPD shield with 4 cooldown and a minus 20 boost debuff. While the shield has a good uptime and it's a good idea to use it as much as possible, especially since it gives that tasty plus 50 boost, it is relatively weak, meaning you need good BPD gear. And the fact that it's a BPD shield, coupled with Frenzy's negative 60 all debuff, means glancing crits really ruin your day with this class and make it really inconsistent. Despite the defensive shortcomings of DragonWarrior's class skills, there are actually 2 factors that make this flaw not as impactful as you might think. First, the support we can get from pets. Our hero's Pet Dragon and Baby Chimera from the Otherworldly Challenges board give us access to useful shields in the form of Dragon Scales and Chimeric Defense. And whilst it is true that every class has access to these tools, DragonWarrior makes better use out of them than any other class. This is because of how Dragon's Frenzy works. It debuffs your all resistance but not your defenses. The 2 aforementioned pets can cover us during Frenzy turns, letting DragonWarrior beat up bosses with less fear of taking a 1000 damage gut punch into your net zero all. Let's go back to our main rotation and see how we can fit pet shields in to cover ourselves. For our original rotation, if we stick a flare at the start and use Baby Chimera's shield just after Frenzy, we can completely cover ourselves during all but one of our Frenzy debuff turns. The only turn we aren't covered is on our Unleash turn, but that's not too bad because we aim to defeat something without Unleash anyway, and that's one less damage source. With regard to Pet Dragon Scales, we can put it in our original rotation and just accept there's one turn under Frenzy where we're not shielded, or we can use the short rotation, which is very handy for dealing with bosses with less health. This rotation deals between 8,000 and about 12,000 damage depending on whether or not you strength stack, use pet buffs like overcharge and that sort of thing. Secondly, and most importantly, no damage mitigation skill is better than just defeating a boss. Offense is the best defense. DragonWarrior has the tools to take down bosses fast, and it's in its best interest to do so. When DragonWarrior can defeat a boss 5 turns faster than another class, that's 5 turns of damage that it isn't taking, or 5 less turns of praying for no glancing crits. This principle isn't as applicable in fights with lots of enemies, such as Ice and Dragons or Chaos Slayers, and it's why DragonWarrior has such a hard time against them. It really struggles with fights with a lot of enemies. For utility skills, there's not a whole lot to talk about. DragonWarrior has Kick, which is a plus 40 health debuff. That, while nice to have, isn't too useful, as DragonWarrior prefers to just punch through health over times most of the time, instead of using up a turn for Kick. Since DragonWarrior is so reliant on weak BPD shields to keep itself alive, gear with good BPD and all res is top priority for challenges. The setup on screen reaches 74 BPD and 60 all resistance, and is my default gear choice when tackling in fights. For your weapon special, besides the racial specials that every class wants to use like Dragon Knight and Vile Rose, you either want to use Cicero's Spare Hammer, this is your defensive option for reducing the risk of glancing crits, or a Light of Evil Dread weapon from Chapter 17 Mogloween, which gives you extra damage on non-crits. Another weapon special that DragonWarrior does find useful is Zorbak's Staff. Since DragonWarrior doesn't have a built-in NPM shield, this can be very clutch in situations where you absolutely need to dodge an attack, such as in Never Apart for Achilles' big super crit nuke. You want a full strength drop as well, including Uragiri or Verad. If you don't have one of those weapons, don't worry, the core DragonWarrior rotation can beat a lot of ARG bosses, and quickly too. You'll have that tier 3 Uragiri or Verad in no time. Generally, you want to stick with your BPD all gear throughout your rotation, unless you need extra damage on Triple or Unleash, in which case you crack out your strength stack. It's a good idea to have 2 strength stacks, one with Uragiri and one without, and with a better all res, so you can sort of half commit to your strength stack on Triple and then go all the way on Unleash. Your stat points and dragon stats are really easy and just pick themselves basically. You want to stick 200 in your strength for your damage. You want to put enough charisma in to make your total up to 50 or 100 with gear. This is useful for dragon cooldowns, but having high charisma is also good for improving your baby chimera's shield. And just stick the rest in endurance. You don't need any in wisdom because the class has no mana issues, at least in challenges. Dragon stats, DragonWarrior always wants 200 in protection to help cover it during frenzy turns, as I've mentioned earlier. You want 200 in magical fighting normally. Remember that DragonWarrior doesn't have a damage over time skill, so you need fighting if you want to kill death-proof enemies. Then you want 199 in either assistance or mischief to help boost your big damage moves. Now it might seem like the plus 25 boost from overcharge is more impactful than the minus 10 all debuff from tickles, but because of DragonWarrior's multiple boost stacks and the diminishing returns you get from boost, the minus 10 all res is actually better against enemies with more than 0 all res. Then just stick the remaining 1 in mischief for the stun. So let's look at how we might tackle some challenges with DragonWarrior. When devising a strategy for an infight, the best way to start is to take our standard rotation and look for the best way to line it up with the boss's rotations. The easiest way to do this is by slapping it in a spreadsheet. You want to put your frenzy turns away from attacks with high bonus, crit, damage or some combination of the 3, unless you have enough shield from Pet Dragon. Since DragonWarrior has no sustain, it wants to beat fights quickly. Longer fights are generally losing matchups for the class. With this in mind, you want to consider how many Fury cycles this fight is going to take. 1 or 2 cycles is ideal, 3 is alright but pushing it a bit, and 4 or more is basically a non-starter. Of course, this is all subject to the amount of damage you face. In easier fights you really don't need to worry, but this numerical rule works pretty well for all modern fights. Let's look at Blade and Bones as an example. Going into this fight, we can see that both the bosses have around 13,500 HP, and their damage mitigation isn't an issue, as we can shield their debuffs and just punch through their shields with a huge bonus from Onslaught. Bearing that HP in mind, with pet support and a strength stack, we can defeat both Dustbolt and Keelhaul in 1 cycle each, for a total of 2, so this is a decent matchup on paper. When tackling duos, it's generally a good idea to use your 2 pet shields to get through the tougher duo part of a fight, then try and just ignore the lesser damage of a single enemy and defeat it before it becomes too much of a problem. For trickier bosses, in particular bosses that get buffed on defeat of their companion, such as Achilles or Hatir, You might wish to spread your defensive options out and use one pet shield per rotation. For bosses with just a little bit too much HP or all resistance to be taken down in one rotation, something around 14,000 HP with 0 all resistance, it's a good idea to use a raw double triple unleash combo first before using Onslaught and Frenzy, just to soften them up a bit so that you can be taken down in one rotation later. You can see this in my Inevitable Equilibrium and Never Apart videos. DragonWarrior has really good uptime on its skills, and you could in theory just loop that one rotation I showed at the start of the video over and over. I mean, Onslaught even has 200% uptime, which is really funny. In practice, unless the boss is literally just a wooden dummy, we're going to be taking too much damage and we're going to need to heal. Now, your in-between rotation need not be super long or arduous. In fact, a very common one is just Health Potion, Strength Strike, Health Potion, and that works pretty well. There are a few DragonWarrior skills that I haven't mentioned yet, and this is because they are on the whole quite useless. So for the rest of the video, as a bit of fun, I'm going to go over how I would change these skills if I was the developer of this game and make them more useful and enjoyable for DragonWarrior players. So first we have power, which is exactly the same as base Warrior's power, but with a massive MP cost and full turn cooldown. It's a very bad deal. I mean, just look at a comparison with Chaos Weaver's Slice. Even besides its high cost, this skill is very rarely useful for two reasons. First, it doesn't fit in our rotation, and secondly, because Dragon's Fury gives plus 100 base damage per hit and not per, attack, and power only hits once, it ends up being worse than double and even final. The first change I'd make would be a class-wide reduction in mana cost. Because DragonWarrior is so quick, mana costs aren't an issue at high levels, but they make the class horrible at low levels and also for use in questing. Since DragonWarrior's rotation is so tight, I think power is best repurposed as a strong filler move to use in between cycles. So here's my suggestion. Power deals 175% damage as normal, but treats your strength stat as if it were doubled. Using the BPD and all res gear I recommend for this class, this new version of power would deal about 460 damage before buffs at level 90. This might seem quite strong, but remember this will only really find use during downtime, and all of DragonWarrior's skills do more damage than this than Dragon's Fury. Next, let's look at Throw. This would be a useful skill if it had a better duration. Against a 0 all resistance enemy, minus 10 all resistance is about the same for your damage as plus 25 boost, once all of DragonWarrior's class buffs are up. If it had a 7 turn duration, it could slot nicely in between Onslaught and Frenzy and provide a bit of extra damage. In my opinion though, this isn't really needed. DragonWarrior's damage is really good without it. I'd do something more interesting and replace the skill with something entirely new, a small means of sustain. Here's my idea. I call the skill Second Wind. It would have a charge time and a cooldown that made it functionally a one-time use skill, similar to Cryptic's Potion Steal. And what it does is it heals for a reasonable amount whilst granting an extra turn, helping to reduce cooldowns, in particular that of Dragon's Flare. This would be a super useful skill to use in between bosses and duos, and might enable potless clears, which are normally out of the question for DragonWarrior. The primary purpose of this skill would be to buy a few extra turns using the health you gain, not making DragonWarrior a sustainable class. I don't believe it should be. Next, let's look at Dragon's Flare. It is a super useful move that combines offense and defense, but I wish the shield was just a little bit better. I'd suggest 160 BPD shield instead of 140 as a midway between Riftwalker and Base Warrior's shield. You'd have to buff the shields of other dragon bases to compensate, but none of them are exactly crying out for nerfs. I'll quickly mention Warcry, which, like power, is taken directly from Warrior, besides its mana cost. It'd be nice if it lasted one turn longer, so you could swap it around with Frenzy in the rotation, but it's not a huge deal. Base Warrior and Riftwalker have this same skill, so DragonWarrior should too. Next, Strength Strike, another skill inherited from Warrior. I mentioned earlier that DragonWarrior relies on BPD shields a lot, its own as well as chimeric defense, which means that glancing crits are a massive pain and a big hit to its reliability. So I propose adding a minus 50 crit debuff to Strength Strike. This isn't as strong as, say, Dragon Mage's crit debuff, but it entirely removes most bosses' intrinsic crit chance, which typically sits at around 20 to 30. I'd also like the skill to reduce boost by just a little bit more, up to 25 or 30. DragonWarrior would really appreciate it, and I'd up the cooldown to compensate for this. You could use this skill before you start a rotation, or even in between Onslaught and Frenzy, to provide some protection for when you're under chimeric defense. Fittingly, the final skill to discuss is exactly that. Final Blow doesn't really make sense in the context of DragonWarrior's toolkit. The only real use case for it is dealing with very strong wind shields and has an okay questing skill. The crit buff is at odds with both Onslaught's crit debuff, which cancels it out completely, and the fact that DragonWarrior always runs strength. And with a strength stack, Final does about the same damage as double, with the added downside that you aren't unlocking triple or unleash. I'd make the skill gel better with DragonWarrior by making it 4 hits instead of 2. This way it gains an additional 200% damage from Dragon's Fury, dealing about the same damage as triple. and has a nice use as a strong skill at the end of the short rotation I mentioned earlier. That concludes my Dragon Warrior guide. Thank you very, very much for listening, and enjoy using the class, or better yet, just use Soul Weaver.